Joining us now from West Palm Beach, near the president-elect's Florida home, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles joins us as well, as does Washington Post senior national political correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Ashley Parker. Vaughn, I will begin with you. What do we know about these calls that Donald Trump is making personally?
We know that Donald Trump and his transition team are acknowledging that the Matt Gaetz confirmation process is going to be an uphill battle, and that on the front end of this, more than 2 months from when these confirmation hearings are set to actually proceed, that they on the front end are working the phones to try to shore up support for Matt Gaetz. You heard Lindsey Graham there. We've heard from the likes of Kevin Cramer. The folks that are receiving these phone calls, we know that J.D. Vance is also intends to go up to Capitol Hill to try to get support for the Matt Gaetz confirmation, all knowing that this could be very well a very tight, close confirmation vote. It's going to take that simple majority, but that is where Donald Trump is one who has been shown an eagerness over the last 9 years to take on these controversial type picks and nominations, and he intends to go through with it.
Ryan, Vaughn just mentioned Senator Cramer. He said he got one of these calls. He called Donald Trump persuasive. What are you hearing on the Hill?
You said something very interesting before you came to us, Katie. You said that Matt Gaetz was not well liked on Capitol Hill, and I think that's probably accurate. But the problem for Senate Republicans that may be uncomfortable with this vote is that he's really liked by one person, and that one person is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump seems willing to do whatever he can to push whatever political capital he has down the throat of Senate Republicans to get Matt Gaetz confirmed. And we're already starting to see many of these Senate Republicans who initially provided some level of concern or question about Gaetz as the nominee, starting to soften their stance. Markwayne Mullin, who you talked about earlier, being the best example, saying that he deserves the opportunity to go through the confirmation process. Even Senator Cramer has softened his tone. Senator Cramer is going to be with Donald Trump today. He's going to get the full court press. And so it's one thing for these Senate Republicans to talk a big game behind closed doors, but when Donald Trump looks at them or talks to them on the phone or has a meeting with them face to face and says, you need to vote for my guy, well, that's a much different conversation. And that's why I still say that up until we see differently, every single one of these nominees has a path to confirmation.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Ashley, what does Donald Trump get exactly out of forcing Republicans to swallow Matt Gaetz?
Well, he gets another loyalty test in certain ways, and this sounds counterintuitive because he is making his own party take a potentially tough vote on Gaetz, but it's like a schoolyard bully seeing just how far they can push their victim or their target. You've done this for me. Now will you do this next thing? Will you go even a step further? You mentioned just then, the number of Republicans who have claimed, even though a lot of them know better and will privately admit that the 2020 election was not stolen, as a litmus test to show their loyalty and devotion to Trump. They have claimed that. This is sort of another red line or marker in just how far they're willing to go to show their devotion to kiss the ring of President-elect Trump.
So I wonder then, Ryan, if this is a test of how far they're willing to go, I wonder if Republicans on the Hill maybe see this as a Rubicon moment. Much like denying the 2020 election pushed them forward, if they allow someone like Matt Gaetz to become AG, is there talk of what they would then be allowing Donald Trump to do, what this is a gateway to?
I think most Senate Republicans would tell you that each individual confrontation that they have with Donald Trump should be viewed independently. And maybe they let Matt Gaetz through, but maybe they'll stand up to him at another point in time during his administration. I don't know if we can take that position at face value, because each and every time Senate Republicans have even modestly challenged Donald Trump, at the end of the day, they've almost always caved. So I think if you're an outside observer and you've watched what's happened in the past and you watch this situation play out, and if they're unwilling to stand up to Donald Trump in this particular situation, especially with a nominee that many people perceive to be as flawed as Matt Gaetz, then you have to assume that that sets the stage for Donald Trump being able to push through whatever he wants through the Congress, because if they're not willing to stand up to him now, what's going to happen when he asks for budget cuts or tax cuts or you name it in terms of enacting his agenda? If their argument is he won the election, he gets what he wants, wants. Why would it be any different after this stage?
But I guess also, what indirectly will they be saying yes to? If they allow Donald Trump to put Matt Gaetz as AG, what are they essentially saying Matt Gaetz can do? What would Donald Trump want Matt Gaetz to do? Is he someone, Ashley, who's out for the public good? Is he a civil service warrior who's going to be looking for public law breaking in order to protect the American public?
Matt Gaetz, as Attorney General, has one client in mind, and that is Donald Trump. He is there to do exactly what Donald Trump wants him to do. He will serve the role that his previous Attorney General did not serve. Donald Trump has made clear he does not want an independent Department of Justice, an independent Attorney General. He wants someone who will be his Roy Cohn, or until recently his Michael Cohen, who will be a fixer and an intimidator, and someone who does his bidding and is loyal, whether or not it pushes the bounds of acceptable behavior.
Yeah, so I guess that brings me to the question I was asking you, Ryan. Do they see this as an indirect acquiescence to whatever might come next, whatever political prosecutions might come out of a DOJ? One, by the way, that Donald Trump would be immune from questioning on, because the Supreme Court has ruled that any interactions between Donald Trump or president and their attorney general, that's out of bounds. Nobody can question it. Nobody can investigate it.
I think if they don't, they're being naive, Katie. But I do think that most Senate Republicans believe that the Department of Justice is in need of reform. They did not agree with the prosecutions of Donald Trump, the criminal prosecutions of Donald Trump, the investigation into Donald Trump, whether it be through the classified documents case or the prosecution around January 6th. So they, in large part, agree with Donald Trump that the Department of Justice needs an overhaul. Whether or not they'd be willing to take that next step of saying that they would agree with using the Department of Justice as an arm for retribution, which Donald Trump has suggested he would do once he takes office, I think that puts the conversation in a completely different sphere. But the point being here, Katie, you're tacitly saying yes to that if you say yes to Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. He has said as much in speeches that he wants to go in and clean house and then do Donald Trump's bidding. So you can't say, yes, I'm just voting for this separately, but then I'm not voting for what could potentially happen after the fact. The two are inextricably linked, and I think that Senate Republicans have to understand that as they go through this process.
I wonder if Donald Trump finds at some point that he cannot get Matt Gaetz through, and that still is a very big maybe at this point. I wonder if there are any other names that are floating around in the Trump ecosphere right now. Vaughn, is it a Todd Blanche? Because Todd Blanche and Matt Gaetz are not the same, at least from the experience that we've so far had with Todd Blanche.
Right. In Todd Blanche and Emile Beauvais, let's be very clear, before they defended Donald Trump in his New York hush money payment trial in New York earlier this year, they both did work as top prosecutors in the Southern District of New York's U.S. Attorney's Office. These men both have experience in the top attorney's office of the DOJ. And so both of these men, if they were to get confirmed by the Senate for Todd Blanchett being the number 2 role as Deputy Attorney General, he would all but be in the position in short order in weeks' time to serve in the role of acting Attorney General. And acting Attorney General has just as much power as the Attorney General, but depending on where these Republican senators indicate that they're willing to go on this Matt Gaetz vote, you very well could see a confirmation process for Attorney General for Todd Blanche instead of Deputy Attorney General. And these are two individuals who I think have less of a public record, let's be very clear, unlike Matt Gaetz, who has campaigned around the country over the last 4 years about clearing house of the DOJ. And so there is many more questions about the exact capacities in which they'd serve. But one thing that we do know is that despite Donald Trump losing on those 34 felony counts in New York, he still had built up a relationship, and one in which he had confidence, because in large part due to Todd Blanche, who you always saw day in and day out standing by the side of Donald Trump, in so often echoing and even going on the attack against the judge in witnesses on behalf of his client. It was notable during that trial that Donald Trump had found somebody who he had confidence in, which was different than so many of the attorneys we had seen him previously work with over the last 8 years.